Hello, everyone. Again, I would like to now introduce Doug Young. Doug is a native Coloradan who's worked on a wide range of environmental issues as a policy analyst and project manager for elected officials, nonprofits, and land management organizations. His work history and educational background includes being a technical service employee with Tetra Tech, working under an Environmental Protection Agency contract to address the cleanup of abandoned hard rock mines, most recently. An affiliate and former senior policy director with the Keystone Policy Center, focusing on reaching consensus solutions to environmental and national resource issues from 2014 on. He was a senior project manager with the Western Land Group in Denver, focusing on land exchanges with federal land agencies for 4 years. He was senior policy director to Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper from 2011 to 2014, where he worked on the full range of environmental policy issues, including oil and gas development, water policy, cleanup of contaminated sites, and abandoned mine cleanups. And most importantly to the current symposium, he was district policy director for Colorado Senator and Congressman Mark Udall from 1998 through 2011, during which time he worked on environmental and natural resource issues such as the cleanup and closure of the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons facility, wilderness legislation, forest fire policies on federal public lands, mine waste cleanup, and other rights of way and transportation and open space preservation issues. Prior to that, he was director of environmental policy for Colorado Governor Roy Romer, working on negotiations for the Animas La Plata water project and other projects. And he was environmental policy advisor to Colorado Senator Tim Wirth, working on environmental and natural resource issues, including Rocky Flats. He graduated from the University of Colorado Boulder with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, and from the University of Colorado Law School with a Juris Doctorate in 1990. I had the pleasure of meeting Doug during my research on Rocky Flats. We spoke on the phone during an interview in which he told me about his involvement in authoring the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge Act of 2001, and very specifically how there came to be a transportation right-of-way provision in that act, which ultimately became part of the route for the proposed Jefferson Parkway. So very knowledgeable policymaker. Everyone, please welcome Doug Young. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Doug Young, and I am a former staffer to a number of elected officials here in Colorado, working on natural resource, environmental, public lands issues. Worked on Rocky Flats issues from about 1993 to about 2013. And I'm here to present about the backdrop and the thought process behind the future land use of Rocky Flats and the development of the National Wildlife Refuge legislation. So once Rocky Flats was officially closed, in the sense that it was no longer going to be manufacturing nuclear weapons components, the future land use became an issue at the site. Certainly there were a lot of other issues that were of concern to people, including the cleanup and management of that effort. But the ultimate future land use was also in the thoughts of the number of stakeholders in the communities around Rocky Flats. And so what I thought I would do is go through a lot of the contextual backdrop of issues that were influencing the thought behind the future land use. And there's three of them. And the first one was concerns about the sites becoming a de facto nuclear material storage and waste disposal site. I should also say that once closure was completed, there were a lot of different stakeholder groups and efforts contemplating future land use. So that was also a contextual background as well, was the fact that there was a lot of efforts underway to consider and think through what to do with this site in the long term. So back again to the first sort of contextual backdrop was because of the nature of the cleanup and that it was part of a nuclear weapons complex site, there hadn't been a whole lot of thinking about what to do eventually with the waste at a place like Rocky Flats. And there was a lot of political contention around some of those aspects. And so the concern was that if we didn't have a vision of what we were going to eventually do with the site after closure, that lack of any kind of planning or thought process or arrangement for the removal of wastes and materials, that Rocky Flats would eventually just become a de facto site for the long term of storing and disposing of this waste. And part of that was because of those obstacles I mentioned at the locations where this material could be shipped to. A lot of those locations were, either concerned about receiving this waste or weren't prepared to receive it. For example, in New Mexico, there's the WIP, stands for the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. It was formerly the project. It's now has been receiving Rocky Flats waste. And there's another facility in Idaho called the Idaho National Energy Lab. And in Utah, there's a place called EnviroCare, which again was also licensed for the receival of this kind of waste. And the concern was that those locations could prohibit or block the acceptance of Rocky Flats material so that it would stay at Rocky Flats. As an example of this, later years, South Carolina, which holds the South Savannah River site, was a location where we could ship the nuclear fashioned or some of the in the pipeline nuclear weapons components. It was capable of receiving that, and South Carolina was resistant to collecting that and receiving it. So again, it just gave the specter of the fact that Rocky Flats could ultimately become the location. So we needed to have sort of vision or future so that it wouldn't become the site where this was stored and disposed of indefinitely. And the Rocky Flats, as many would probably agree, is not an appropriate location for this kind of a facility, for either a storage long-term or a waste disposal site, for obvious reasons. And the other issue for us in terms of thinking through the future land use was that there is challenges in securing appropriate funds from Congress if you don't have a mission or a future for the land use. And it would have been easier and simpler to just leave the material there and turn it into a storage and disposal site. The other contextual background were the surrounding and growing development pressures around Rocky Flats. And a lot of this is influenced by the fact that the Department of Energy, which at the time was the Atomic Energy Commission that acquired Rocky Flats, the property to locate that facility there, did not acquire the underlying mineral estate. So it only acquired the surface. So there are private mineral estate holders that still exist under Rocky Flats, or at the time did, and they were interested in accessing and developing their mineral rights, especially post-closure, because they could have that capability to do that. Also, on the northwest corner of the site, not on the property, but right adjacent to it in the northwest corner, is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's wind energy testing site. And they were interested in seeking some additional space on the Rocky Flats property buffer zone so that they can do some additional technology testing of wind turbines. And so that was another interest or a contextual flavor for seeing some reuse of the site land. Another issue was land exchange. There was a land exchange proposed for the southeast corner of the buffer zone of the site in order to deal with development pressures as well as some transportation access issues. And so that's another example of the interest in trying to use Rocky Flats in some fashion. There was obviously development, growth was growing in that direction in terms of residential development and other types of development. So that interest of, what do we do with this piece of property and that surrounding development was paramount or was present. Then we have some utility rights of ways that are existing on the site. This is a little like the mineral interest, where there's existing ownership interests for power lines and some water, and those interests wanted some future access and extension of those facilities and maintenance of that in the future. And then there, as I mentioned, some economic reuse thinking was underway about how we could turn this into a continued asset for economic reuse. And an example for that would be Rocky Flats Cold War Museum to explain what happened out there. And then there were also some transportation infrastructure interests, and I'll get to this later, but that was also a factor in the contextual, what do we do with the site? Do we allow for some transportation activity or options that involve some Rocky Flats property? And as I mentioned, the local communities and stakeholders were examining the future uses during this time and were considering recommendations. And one of those recommendations included preserving it as open space. So that's the second one. And then the third contextual flavor for this was how to manage the land and resources of this federal facility. This was a property owned and managed by the Department of Energy in the surface sense. And the questions were at the time was, is DOE the appropriate long-term manager of this resource? Since it was no longer going to be producing nuclear weapons materials, and once it was cleaned up and closed, would DOE be the appropriate, land manager? And those questions, which I'll quickly go through, was whether that agency had open space preservation missions, whether they're the right people to do wildlife protection and management, and other types of land managed activities like for weeds and fire. And then there's a facility on the property called the Lindsay Ranch, which is an old ranch, and there was some interest about protecting that for historical preservation purposes. As I mentioned, the mineral development interests and whether DOE is the right agency to work with mineral developers, because again, that isn't necessarily their forte. And then any type of potential recreation, if any, DOE again may or may not have been the right agency to deal with that or work with that. And as an example, during this time frame, the Department of Energy promulgated something called the Rock Creek Reserve Designation in the spring of 1999 for a portion of the buffer zone. And this was designed to allow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to manage that portion of the buffer zone for its resource values. And so that just again suggests or showed that the DOE might not have been the right long-term manager. So that was the third contextual nature of the backdrop of what to do with the future of the site. So given that conversations that we're having with local communities and the stakeholders and the public and the agencies, the Congressman Mark Udall at the time introduced legislation to begin that conversation of what to do with this future. And he picked up a lot of the ideas that were already being considered by local communities and stakeholders. And his bill would do the following, or would have done the following. It would keep the site in perpetual federal ownership. So that way it would stay in the responsibility of the United States in terms of its ongoing responsibility for maintaining the cleanup components and all the liability that might come with that, so that they were always on the hook to make sure that they were everything was okay and public health and safety was being protected. Again, they would retain all the lands inside the fence line, so potentially keep it in federal ownership the entire site. It would preclude development in the buffer zone. It left open the idea of what to do about the industrial center, because that was still being considered and discussed by the community. It would require that the buffer zone be managed as open space. It would preclude disposal of any acreage of the site, which sort of touches upon that land exchange idea I mentioned before, so that it would always stay in federal ownership. And then it also created a community advisory council to recommend open space uses and types that would be allowed or restricted, and think through the appropriate land manager. That council was broadly constituted or thought through in the legislation, so that we would get thoughts on how best to use that open space eventually. It also explicitly precluded the open space land use under that legislation from affecting cleanup requirements. So that, in other words, whatever was going to be required for public health and safety, that was to continue, and that the land use as envisioned in this bill would not affect that and allow those conversations and discussions to continue as they were. And then the bill would solicit public input, not only in the legislation as proposed, but also again on how to manage the open space itself. So once that was proffered, we got a lot of feedback from the stakeholders in the community, and the result was morphing this into the Wildlife Refuge Act. And so, in other words, the thought about preserving the open space and all of the natural assets there in the long term was so well thought of that we advanced it, or the community suggested and others suggested we advanced it to a wildlife refuge, go one step further. That also helped not only preserve its open space and its resources, but it also helped decide that would be the future management. It would be managed by an agency that could handle that kind of resource, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was enacted in December of 2001. And I would say part of this was the genesis of this was that it was a reaction to the open space proposal, again, taking a step further. And we also had an example of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is also a federal facility in the Denver metro area. And that facility manufactured pesticides and chemical weapons by the U.S. Army. And the cleanup and closure of that envisioned that being converted into a national wildlife refuge. And so that was kind of a model that we brought to Rocky Flats. And the legislation, the Wildlife Refuge Act legislation, contained essentially the same elements as UDOL's proposal, but with these differences, which I'll go into. The first was the cleanup. The refuge designation specifically said that it cannot reduce the level of cleanup, and that the cleanup levels would be established by the Rocky Flats Cleanup Agreement. And at that time that this was done, those were being negotiated by the agencies that were parties to the cleanup agreement, which is DOE, the EPA, and the state of Colorado. So the legislation said that those discussions go to set those levels, and that this designation cannot result in any reducing whatever that agreement was reached by those parties. The other provisions that were different was there was a specific transfer of the acreage for NREL for the wind technology facility for expansion. The DOE retains responsibility for the industrial center, whereas the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would then manage the buffer zone. There was an explicit prohibition on through roads. I'll get to that in the transportation section here just next. And it included a refuge planning process that included community involvement and participation in that. It established the Rocky Flats Museum, and it included this transportation provision, which I'll now turn to. This provision, at the time, there was a contextual aspect to this, was that, as I mentioned before, the Beltway was being considered to be completed through the metro, around the metro area, and there was some thought about actually completing the Beltway right through Rocky Flats. So there was some proposals floating out there that the people were thinking of just routing it through Rocky Flats, almost bisecting it. And there was a lot of concerns about doing that. However, at the same time, there was interest in trying to deal with the pressures of continued growth around that area and provide for transportation facilities that could handle that growth and residential and commercial development. So there was still some interest in including some transportation aspect to the future of Rocky Flats, and that was also included in the local government's coalition of local governments recommendations as well, was to look at how transportation could be improved in the area by use of some portion of Rocky Flats. So this was requested by the local communities to include something regarding this. And it was also a reflection of that cutting of the southeast corner in terms of that land exchange. So this was also a reaction to that. And we needed, working for congressional offices, we needed the support from local communities to pass this refuge legislation. And this was a component of getting that support, was to include this provision. And it is limited to 300 feet along the western edge of Indiana. The language specifically says that whatever is done in terms of that improvement of that 300 feet, once it's given to or provided to the local governments for this transportation facility, that it must minimize adverse effects to the refuge, and that in order to provide this 300 feet to the local communities for transportation improvements, that it must be within the regional transportation plan, which is developed by DRCOG, which is the Denver Regional Council of Governments, and that once the provision of the right-of-way is done, it must comply with applicable law in terms of how it's to be constructed, if there is any right-of-way constructed once that's done. Anyway, so that's it. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.